Picture this: a woman, barely conscious, dragged across jagged stone floors while the torchlight flickers against walls stained with decades of human despair. Her screams bounce off the vaulted ceiling, mixing with the groans of others already rotting in the darkness below. This isn't hell, though it might as well be. This is a medieval prison, and for women, it was designed to do something far worse than simply cage the body. It was engineered to annihilate the soul. The moment her feet crossed that threshold, whether she was guilty of theft, accused of sleeping with the wrong man, or simply suspected of whispering the wrong prayer, her life as she knew it ended. And what replaced it was a symphony of calculated cruelty that would make modern horror films look like bedtime stories. The guards didn't ask questions. They didn't care about her story. The first thing they did, often within minutes of her arrival, was shave her head. Not gently, not with care, but roughly, violently, as if removing a pest. Hair, you see, wasn't just hair. In medieval Europe, a woman's hair was her crown, her modesty, her femininity. It was the one thing society allowed her to possess with pride. So naturally, the system ripped it away first. The humiliation was immediate and public. Other prisoners watched. Guards laughed. And she stood there, scalp bleeding, identity stripped, reduced to a shivering shell of shame. This wasn't about lice or hygiene, though that's what they claimed. This was about breaking her before the real horrors even began. Then came the iron. Shackles weren't reserved for the violent or the dangerous. No, in medieval prisons, they were standard issue for women, regardless of their alleged crime. Heavy iron cuffs clamped around wrists and ankles, sometimes connected by chains so short she couldn't stand upright. In 13th century England, records from York and London describe women locked in what they called bilbos, leg irons that kept them immobile for weeks, sometimes months. Some were chained directly to the stone walls, arms stretched above their heads until circulation failed and fingers turned black. The worst part? Many of these women hadn't been convicted of anything. They were simply accused, awaiting trial in conditions designed to ensure they wouldn't survive long enough to see one. The architecture of these prisons tells you everything you need to know about their purpose. These weren't rehabilitation centers or places of reflection. They were dungeons in the truest, most nightmarish sense. Most were repurposed corners of castles, dank monastery basements, or forgotten chambers beneath city halls. The air was thick with mold, human waste, and the sour stench of decaying flesh. There were no windows, no ventilation, no light except the occasional torch carried by a guard who came to throw in stale bread or drag out a corpse. Women were packed into these spaces alongside murderers, thieves, debtors, and the mentally ill. There was no separation, no privacy, no safety. Violence was constant. Rape was common. And the authorities? They turned a blind eye. After all, these women were already deemed morally corrupt simply by being there. What happened to them behind those iron doors was seen as an extension of their punishment, or worse, as something they deserved. Legal scholars of the time didn't even pretend to disguise their contempt. Ulrich Tengler, a German jurist, wrote in his widely circulated legal manual that women in prison should be confined and abased. Not reformed, not treated fairly, abased. The word itself drips with disdain. The purpose of imprisonment, according to Tengler and many like him, wasn't justice. It was humiliation. It was isolation. It was the systematic erasure of a woman as humanity, until she became nothing more than a cautionary tale for others. And the process worked. Women who entered these prisons, even if they were eventually released, left as ghosts of their former selves, scarred both physically and mentally, forever branded by a system that saw them as less than human. But perhaps the most insidious part of this entire system was how it normalized cruelty. Guards weren't seen as monsters, they were just doing their jobs. Judges weren't seen as sadists, they were upholding the law. And society? Society watched, sometimes even gathered to witness the public shaming that often preceded imprisonment and nodded in approval. Because in medieval Europe, a woman's suffering wasn't just punishment. It was entertainment. It was a reminder of what happened when you stepped out of line, when you dared to exist outside the narrow confines of obedience and submission. The prison wasn't just a building, it was a weapon, wielded with precision against anyone who threatened the patriarchal order. And for women, it was the ultimate tool of control, a place where accusation alone was enough to sentence you to a living death. But if you think the horrors ended with shackles and shaved heads, brace yourself, because what came next makes those initial degradations look merciful. Deep beneath the main prison floors, hidden from public view and often unmarked on any official map, were the starvation cells. The French had a charming name for them, oubliettes, which literally translates to the place of forgetting. And forget they did. Women, lowered into these hellish pits through narrow trapdoors, were swallowed by darkness so complete it felt alive. These weren't cells in any traditional sense. They were stone coffins, sometimes barely wide enough to sit in, with ceilings so low you couldn't stand. No bedding, no light, no sound except the scurrying of rats and the distant echo of your own breathing. And most horrifying of all, no guarantee you'd ever get out. The authorities didn't always bother with formal execution. Why waste the effort when you could simply toss a woman into one of these holes and let nature do the work? Starvation wasn't listed as an official punishment, of course. That would be too honest, too barbaric even by medieval standards. Instead, they simply forgot to feed prisoners. Bread and water, the supposed standard rations, became luxuries. Days would pass, then weeks. The body, desperate for fuel, begins to consume itself. Fat disappears first, then muscle, then organ tissue. The mind fractures under the weight of isolation and hunger. Hallucinations become constant companions. Some women screamed until their voices gave out. Others clawed at the stone walls until their fingernails were torn off and their hands were nothing but bloody stumps. And when they finally died, their bodies were dragged out, dumped in unmarked graves outside the prison walls, and erased from all official records. No names, no acknowledgement, just silence. The conditions inside these starvation cells accelerated death in ways that were almost scientifically calculated. Without sanitation, prisoners lay in pools of their own urine and feces. Infections spread rapidly. Lice and fleas feasted on weakened bodies. Open sores became gangrenous. Dehydration caused tongues to swell and crack. And the psychological torture was perhaps even more effective than the physical. The complete absence of light destroys your sense of time. You don't know if you've been down there for hours or months. You don't know if anyone remembers you exist. You don't even know if you're still alive or if this is some eternal punishment beyond death. That uncertainty, that hopelessness, broke people faster than any rack or whip ever could. And the authorities knew it. They understood that fear of the oubliette was as powerful as the oubliette itself. Women throughout medieval Europe whispered about these cells, terrified that one wrong word, one false accusation, one moment of bad luck could land them there. And that fear kept them compliant, kept them silent, kept them trapped in a system designed to ensure they never questioned their place. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the starvation cells was how they were used against women accused of moral crimes, prostitution, adultery, even something as vague as living without governance, which essentially meant existing as an independent woman without male supervision. These weren't violent criminals. They were women who dared to live outside the rigid boundaries society had drawn, and for that audacity, they were buried alive in stone tombs and left to rot. The system didn't just want to punish them, it wanted to make them disappear, to erase any evidence they'd ever existed. And it succeeded. Thousands of women vanished into these cells, their stories lost to history, their suffering absorbed by the cold, indifferent stone that entombed them. Their screams echoed for a while, growing weaker day by day until eventually there was nothing. Just silence. Just darkness. Just the faint smell of decay that guards learned to ignore as they walked past sealed trapdoors, knowing exactly what lay beneath but never acknowledging it. Because that was the point. The oubliette wasn't just a cell, it was a statement. It told women that they were disposable, that their lives held no value, that they could be erased with no consequences and no accountability. And that message, delivered through starvation, isolation, and calculated cruelty, reinforced a social order that depended on women's fear and submission. The medieval prison system didn't just cage bodies, it weaponized suffering, transforming punishment into a tool of patriarchal control so effective, so psychologically devastating, that its echoes can still be felt today whenever authority is used to police women's morality, autonomy, and existence.